Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to HKUST to attend Professor Li Jie's wonderful talk. I guess Professor Li Jie is a renowned scholar who does not need an introduction, but for formality's sake, I still want to give you a very brief introduction to Professor Li. Professor Li Jie is a professor of East Asian languages and civilizations at Harvard University. She is the author of Shanghai Homes, Palimpsests of Private Life, Utopian Ruins, a memorial museum of the Mao era, and Cinematic Guerrillas, Propaganda, Projectionists, and Audiences in Socialist China, which won the Krasina Kras Movie Image Book Award, the Catherine Singer Kovacs Book Award from the Society for Cinema and Media Studies, and honorable mention for the Joseph Levinson Book Prize from the Association for Asian Studies. She also co-edited the volume Red Legacies in China, Cultural Afterlives of the Communist Revolution, and published various articles on film, media, museum, and sound studies. Li Jie was named a Harvard College professor for her contributions to undergraduate teaching, as well as a Walter Channing Cabot Fellow for scholarly eminence in the fields of literature, history, and art. So here I want to highlight one of Professor Li Jie's monographs, Cinematic Guerrillas. This is a new book, and I have been using this book for my graduate course, Socialist Film Culture. And if you have the time, just feel free to take a look, circle this around. Yeah, this is a new book. And before Professor Li starts her talk, I want to say that if you can, please don't take photos of the slides and don't upload them to social media. In today's world, we don't want to go viral online. So just, listen to her lecture carefully and ask questions during the Q&A. Okay, now let's welcome Professor Li to deliver her wonderful talk. Okay, give him applause.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Du, for inviting me here. It's truly an honor to be at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And I'm also really grateful for everyone for coming from different parts of Hong Kong to make it to the talk. I'm very moved to see you here, and especially quite a few of your scholarship has been very influential for me. This talk, actually, this topic dates back. I was looking up my emails, I think a conversation that Professor Du and I had back in 2019, actually, because I don't work on animation per se, but she suggested that, these slideshows that are actually like that have movements, isn't that animation? And so that actually inspired me to think harder about this topic, but because of COVID, because of various reasons, I kept on postponing the writing of this paper until very recently. And it also gives me a great opportunity to extend a topic that's actually on the cover of my book, but I don't actually go into it in detail on because you would notice that the projectionist here is not really, the film projector is in the background, but what's in the foreground is her clappers, and she's actually giving a clapper talk that accompanied by like slide projection. So these the three lenses here are these triple lens or quadruple lens slide projectors that can make actually animated special effects. And that's what today's talk is about. But because it's a very new, for me, I haven't given this talk before. So like I'm also really looking for your feedback before I actually write this up. Okay, let me move to the next slide. So I think the lantern slideshow, I don't know how many of you still remember actually sitting in classrooms with actually slide projectors as the teaching tool. But I think by the 21st century, most of us don't have it anymore. I was delighted to see there's an overhead projector here, which reminds me actually of high school. But it was a really important form of local propaganda, education, and entertainment in China, especially from the 1950s to the 1980s. It's quite simple to produce, and you can use very locally available materials. So lantern slides actually can be projected using gas lamps without electricity. So grassroots propaganda artists and film projectionists, they were drawing, writing, projecting, and narrating their own slideshows. So they're able to create local media content before the availability of photography, film, and radio in the 1950s already. So whereas rural audiences, they said, well, when cinema did come about, cinema was live or animated, 是活的. But slideshows were still or dead. But there were innovative experimentations with slideshow animations or animated slides, in particular by a so-called Three Sisters projection team from Laishui County in Hebei province that became famous nationwide by the mid-1960s. So they invented this multiple lens slide projector and then performed them with clapper talk. So they're also the only projection team that actually whose slide projection has been filmed. So I'll just play a video clip from a 1966 newsreel of their slideshow. This is basically 3 slides that are dissolved into each other. I'll explain the
称为小电影或土电影。片中说唱快板的就是李景贤，右边的是大姐郑义珍，左边的是二姐张不容。他们给自己做了大体分工，郑义珍做队长，负责联系放映、制定计划、上报总结等全面工作。李景贤负责编写材料、绘制表演幻灯，张不容则负责发电和设备。
Okay, so they're shown writing scripts and then drawing the slides and also performing them. And over the next 2 decades, actually, cultural cadres all over China were recruiting artists, writers, performers, technicians to develop slideshows, sometimes animated slideshows. So that was actually my father's first work unit when he was a Sendang youth in Northeast China. He was spared the labor of going into the fields to work to draw lantern slides. And then, so over my, okay. So some of the sort of key question and overview, I think what I'm doing in effect is a media archaeology of animated slideshows, but I also want to try to explore the creative ecology of socialist China, as well as reflect, perhaps also with your help, on human creativity in the age of generative AI. And by creative ecology, I mean the cultural, technological, political, socioeconomic, and institutional conditions that influence the flourishing and withering of creativity. And I'm quite interested in the relationship between propaganda, technology, and creativity. So how might propaganda promote or stifle, mobilize or immobilize creativity? What is the relationship between technology and creativity? And throughout the course of my talk, I also want to shift from the question of what animated socialist slideshows to what did socialist slideshows animate. A quick sort of overview of its history, right? Magic Lantern, of course, is actually its own field of study, but in general, they're quite lightweight and portable and arrived in China as early as the 17th century and was widely used by the early 20th century for performance, entertainment, preaching, and education. I'm just going to play this clip from Yuan Muzhi's Scenes of City Life, where he actually plays a peep show projectionist in before as a framing device for the entire film. For the film's expose of capitalism and commodification in Shanghai. But overall, this imported technology became an important medium for local artists to also exhibit and market their talent. Merchants displayed slides and sold New Year prints of the same image. Storytellers used slides to illustrate their ballads. And of course, slide projectors were used in classrooms and movie theaters in urban areas. But after 1949, the Chinese Communist Party readily enlisted this versatile medium of lantern slides or magic lanterns into the propaganda network, so that rural sort of county-level cultural centers, which were called Wenhuaguan, they were equipped with lanterns years before the arrival of cinema and radio. So these are just sort of some basic statistics. A lot of this was actually in North China between Shanxi and Hebei provinces, and they were also making a lot of these slide projectors on their own, and there's a lot of lantern slide manuals at the time that explained the virtues of lantern slides over cinema in a number of ways. One I mentioned already, that it doesn't need electricity. You can use gas lamps, and the projectors themselves can be constructed with local materials. They also use color, so even films were black and white at the time, or photography was mostly black and white, but you can use color and sound to attract audiences, and they usually represented local events. So the manuals just praise the medium's low-tech flexibility, portability, and indigeneity. So a lot of that can be captured by the word tu, right? Which is earthy, rustic, primitive, local. I don't know if rustic cinema is the best translation of tu dianying, but slideshows came to be dubbed tu dianying, especially when there was movement involved. My favorite anecdote is actually this one. There's a Shanxi cultural worker who explained how they built their own lantern slide actually with the help of a pumpkin. So what came to mind for me is like a jack-o'-lantern for Halloween being constructed as a kind of slide projector or magic lantern. And but most of them look more like this, right? There's a single lens on them, and they are really made with by local cultural centers, also artists associations and science education equipment workshops. But soon they thought that audiences, they might not find these kind of slide projections to be all that interesting. So these model lanternists, they introduced ways to turn these dead slides into living ones already in the 1950s. So first they changed single images to image series, and then they added, they changed the narration to clapper talk. And some of them use paper marionette figures that are almost akin to shadow puppets. And another commonly used way of animating the slides was to make them into panoramic strips that are pulled through the slide projector, so it looks like there's some kind of movement, such as a train passing through, a person walking. And the speed of the movement actually depended a lot on the content. So like foot soldier would be moving at a slower pace, whereas the cavalry with horses would move maybe faster, but with a jolting pace, depending on how you move the slide itself. And then vehicles would be even faster. The same goes for vertical movements. I don't have an illustration of but rain would come down faster, whereas the sun would rise gradually. This is the illustration is from much later. And so there were also manual adjustments to lighting. So there would be, you can create a night scene with green cellophane over the lens, or creating the illusion of sunrise by covering half of the lens with a piece of paper. Now, this is actually not new per se, because as early as the 18th and 19th century, there were movement slides in Europe, US, and Japan, and you can see some examples here from 1880s. And Tom Lamar has written about panorama slides in Meiji Japan as follows, saying the landscape has unfurled in projection, rather like a picture scroll, unrolling before the eyes. The magic lantern slide was pulled slowly or quickly by hand past the focalized light, allowing for variable temporality, may be punctuated with commentary, the time of gesture and speech. So I think it's interesting to emphasize the time of gesture and speech, that the temporality is not mechanical. So what actually animated the slideshow is not actually a machine, but rather the performer's body. Their gestures, their vocal sound effects enlivened the still images and mandated the speed, direction, and quality of movement, which is very different mechanically also from the succession of instants in cinema. The lantern slide projection is almost somewhere between a machine operator and an instrument performer. So you actually perform the lantern slide, almost 演幻灯 rather than just 放幻灯, right? And at the production level, of course, also local culture workers were hand-making these slide projectors with local materials. And so they're actually a little closer to almost like unique, I don't know about works of art, but at least artisanship. And there were many conferences and competitions held at the local level to inspire technical and formal innovations. And meanwhile, the content of the slides also represented local people and affairs so that their audiences, usually rural audiences, can see their acquaintances honored on screen and then vow to work much harder to get into the slideshow as well. So in that sense, slides not only emulated lifelike movements, but also captivated and mobilized their audiences. So in some ways, I think about reception as a kind of very interactive because it's also responding to what's going on in the room. And in reading through various ways of making slides, there's some lantern or film projectionists who were making lantern slides, but they were not good artists, so they couldn't make. So part of their work is to address local priorities when they come to a village or to a township. So one instance I read about in, I think in Guangdong, is that a movie team was trying to draw a pest. It's called the rice plant hopper, but they couldn't actually get it right. So they asked the local cadre to go to the field and capture some, actually from the field live, and then put them inside, like between glass, almost a bit like a microscope. And so that the heat of the light bulb actually made them move and in a very agitated way. So they're over-animated in some ways, right? And then audiences, like, seeing the magnified insects really realized the danger of the pest, and then they were willing to buy the insecticide to put them out. And I found like manuals later from 1970s that actually tell you how to fight pests using slideshows by capturing the insects that you want to kill. So much of these experiments happened already in the 1950s, but it was really by the early 1960s that animated slideshows became popularized thanks to one projection team that many teams were actually learning from called they were dubbed the Three Sister movie team. And I actually made a whole trip, which I'll talk about in a bit, about trying to find the three sisters, the three women who represented, socialist film projection in the countryside, going through the snows and mountains to show films to the peasants, and also making slideshows and being inventors and artists all embodied in one. But what I realized as looking through the sources already is that their story has to start earlier with their mentor, their teacher, and who was actually one of the earlier sort of inventors of this double, triple lens slideshow. His name is Wang Baoyi. Wang Baoyi was a school teacher initially, and then he was recruited as a propaganda worker for the local Wenhua Guan, the cultural center, And his job was to organize village drama troupes as well as to conduct so-called rooftop broadcasting, which is like before there was actually wired broadcasting or radio. Some messages were transmitted via like mimeograph into the villages, and then there would be like human loudspeakers, essentially, people who are like sitting or standing on a rooftop or on top of a mountain reading out a sentence at a time, and then someone will relay the same message at the next rooftop. So this was called 屋顶广播, and so that's something that cultural cadres were also doing in order to extend the governance throughout the country, right? Also into the countryside without any electrification. And so that's a part of that. He found a projector inside, I don't know which kind he found, but he found a sort of a magic, I guess it's more like a magic lantern that's in the cultural center itself. And then he wanted to, he thought this is quite an interesting technology. It's the most advanced technical object in the whole culture center. They didn't even have a radio. And it reminded him of La Yang Pian, right? These peep shows that he had seen at temple fairs, but the Huandeng, that projector was projecting outwards into a public. And so he was developing, he found a set of slides. I actually have some slides that are passed around. There's sort of a set of glass slides, and then there's also a set of slides about Leifeng, so you can take a look at the materiality of these slides. They're not animated slides, though. Those have not survived. So Wang himself, Wang Baoyi, began producing and narrating his slideshows on market days to propagate the marriage law, the 3 anti and 5 anti campaigns, and also the Korean War. He also assisted and later joined the prefectural mobile projection team. At that time, he was also still producing slides and then doing clapper talk. And one thing he mentioned in his memoir is that the local models who might be praised would also interrupt because they're a little embarrassed by what's being said about them being praised. And then so the whole show turned into a crosstalk or 相声, and the audience was quite enlivening the scene with laughter. Wang already started making experiments. Well, actually, this is the sound of clapper talk again, so try to imagine that there's after so many years, I still haven't learned it myself. I should really go apprentice myself to a clapper storyteller. So he was also experimenting with trying to add a lens onto the existing. So what you saw earlier were all like single lens projector, and he started building another lens so that it became possible to put, say, two slides and then make them alternate. Right, so it's like a basic 2-frame animation of a lion dance, for example. And so that already started to charm audiences. He also developed some other techniques that I'll get into. And a lot of this won him competitions and even an opportunity to meet Chairman Mao himself in the 1957 Model Worker Conference. But as much as he tried to apply for Communist Party membership, the application would be rejected because his father had once worked as a policeman under Japanese occupation. But he still very eagerly tried to, serve as a good propaganda worker and answer the party's call with every campaign. So in 1957, there was this eager hope to develop mobile projection network to increase the number of projection teams. And so Wang Baoyi was in charge of recruiting more people. And he read about female projectionists, especially all female teams. And so, these were from Zhejiang and Hubei provinces, and there's a lot of information about them in the press. Actually, I thought there would be more female projectionists initially before I went to interview, and then I realized they're a tiny minority, but somehow the propaganda materials really emphasized that there were female projectionists. So in some ways, perhaps like iconic female tractor drivers that Daisy has also written about. They took on this physically demanding job that also required mechanical and engineering skills. So female projectionists' appearance in public also embodied a new model of gender equality and countered patriarchal norms. So at the same time that these 3 women were recruited, Wang Baoyi also recruited 6 young men to cover the county's more remote and mountainous regions. So the 3 sisters were only showing films in the county area and on the plains. And all 9 rookie projectionists, this is the only photo actually found of them. This is actually from an Anhui film gazetteer when they went to learn from Hebei projectionists. So, and then they learned all these animated tricks. They also developed innovated new animation techniques and also expanded the propaganda repertoire. So I almost thought that this kind of team is very similar to maybe today's startup company in some ways, right? But they didn't have a patent, they didn't develop a product, but they did share their technical know-how very freely from any projection team that was willing to learn. And then Wang Baoyi and others had contributed to writing this manual actually for projection teams around the country to build their own multi-lens projector and making animated slideshows. So there's a lot of sort of technical information here I won't go into, but it's adding lenses and reflectors, levers and pulleys, also instructions on how to paint and make special effects, and also how to script, also making scripts that are very much like film scripts. So among the special effects that they were able to come up with are, this would be like radio waves that are spiraling and making it turn. And I mentioned sort of the 2-frame animation with the lion dance. A variation of that would be a longer strip that you can, 2 strips that are being pulled through at the same time so that it looks like a parade that's passing by. And there might also be sound effects. There would be like an LPA record also saying what music accompaniment will be used. I quite like the horse, the great leap horse, 跃进马, that gallops against the background of a socialist countryside. And in some ways, this image really harkens back to the very first moving picture in 1878, The Horse in Motion. But instead of Edward Muybridge's multiple cameras capturing sequential images, there are only 4 slides superimposed onto each other. And then there's also the animation of the sunflower, which is a sunflower faces a sun, and whereas Chairman Mao is a sun, right? So there's also sort of the effect of sunshine in the background, which I think this is kind of almost like a slideshow recreation here of the sunlight shining in the background. So this really charmed audiences and won them fame. But the manual, they also mentioned also using basically shadow puppetry, and so drawing from more traditional arts and also paper cuts. Some of the slides are actually made out of paper. I don't have samples of that because they didn't last very long. But the manual did emphasize that special effects or animation should not be pursued frivolously or to showcase technical ingenuity, but rather they have to serve the propaganda content. So one negative example cited here is that one projection team was supposed to show the miseries of old society through a poor peasant's memories of begging for food. And then he got bitten by a landlord's dog. But the lanternists, they animated the dog, they over-animated the dog. And also the performer was vocalizing its barking. So as a result, the audience was laughing, and they thought this was a really comedic scene rather than like a tragic, they were laughing instead of crying. So that's the wrong way to use animation. And a positive example, by contrast, is to sort of Okay, so first, it begins with a riddle. The projectionist would ask, head like a crab with joints at its waist. This animal has long tail and 8 legs. And then when somebody guesses the right answer, you would see the appearance of a scorpion. And then the narrator would continue, all scorpions sting. All landlords are mean. And then at this point, there would be a vertical wipe here that replaces the scorpion's head with the landlord's head. And then also the scorpion's tail with the landlord's abacus. And, and then the narration says, scorpions are poisonous and ruthless, but landlords are 10 times as cruel. So the use of these sophisticated transitions, which also combines, they talk a lot about transitions, about when do you use a cut, when do you use a wipe, when do you use a dissolve, and what effect it's supposed to have. It creates mystery and establishes equivalence between class enemies and malicious animals. And so I am very much reminded, and also Daisy has written about sort of the disappearance of talking animals and the animality of villains in your book, and also the aesthetics of over animation and suspended animation. So in the case, I think these usages of animals in the slides, examples that we have are also quite interesting. You have a dog that's over-animated extension of the landlord, but you also have a scorpion as a metaphor and then they're sort of exposing the essence of the landlord as that he, 显影, or becoming like exposed as a scorpion. So I'll be happy to discuss this a bit more in the Q&A, but I also want to get into kind of this team itself and what I have been able to find through field work, because it's such a famous projection team. They're, the subject of a newsreel.
由郑义珍、李景贤、张富荣组成的3姐妹放映队，是放映工作者的一面红旗。
1966年3月，中央新闻纪录电影制片厂拍摄的这段新闻简报，让人们第一次从银幕上看到了来水县3姐妹放映队的形象。
So there's a lot of press about them. There are propaganda posters about them. There's newsreels about them. They, there's sort of accounts of how they overcame the gossip of villagers, and then they were initially, failing at their learning the machines. And then, but their villager hosts treated them like daughters, gave them the warmest part of the beds, and boiling many eggs for them as snacks. And then they braved snow and ice and went into the most remote mountains to show films to the mountain dwellers. And then that they also performed, and these are some of the photographs, actually the best quality photographs of film screenings under the moon, and by People's Pictorial magazine. We also have images really of them not only performing but making the slides. But when I went to the field trip, almost like paying pilgrimage to this model projection team back in 2017 to see if I can find the original 3 sisters and see if I can talk to them. One had already passed away by then, another could not be found, and a third refused to meet us despite appeals on our behalf by her former teacher and cousin. But other colleagues, and it turned out that we realized that it's actually a much larger group of people who made up of this 3-sister movie team. There is an exhibition hall, and I'll get back to this. And so a few of their former colleagues did talk to us and told us that, well, they were performers, but they didn't paint, they didn't write, they didn't invent, as they had been credited in the press. Instead, the slideshows were pretty much all scripted by Wang Baoyi and painted by, so this is the press pictures, but actually the real artist of a lot of their famous slides is this man, Mr. Yan, who was an amateur artist and lanternist who applied a lot of visual, different visual styles to enrich the medium's expression means. He recalled that he had to keep the colors transparent while ensuring accuracy in the miniature format, and any mistake would be magnified through projection. Right? This is just images from a manual, but trying to imagine what it's like to actually paint the slides. And it was quite strenuous for his eyes, hands, and shoulders. And the work actually left him with all these medical issues that when we visited him later. But at the same time, he didn't consider, himself did not even keep a single slide that he had painted after all those years. And the ones we found in the museums looked like this. They basically almost, you can barely see what's on them anymore. So he said they're not really works of art, but rather an effective propaganda means that demanded craftsmanship. And for him, it's very much a livelihood, too. And then other male colleagues that we had interviewed also contributed their ideas, talents, and labor, but they were supposed to be the 红花下的绿叶, so the green leaves beneath the red flowers. And then it's the three women who were the three sisters who went on these nationwide tours. And then their audiences also shifted from the grassroots peasants to political elites. So they performed for Premier Zhou Enlai, but also for Liu Shaoqi and Wang Guangmei. And when there are newsreel photographs of them going into the countryside, these are all places they never went to normally. They were all staged for the magazine, and so like their colleagues were sort of carrying their equipment for them, and and going in to show films in villages that they had never been to before. So former colleagues actually, they refer to the three sisters as a kind of 灯下黑, which means darkness under the lamp, suggesting that somehow the media limelight actually obscured much more than it illuminated. And then some green leaves, these men swallowed their pride, but one projectionist, Liu, was quite angry, and he lashed out at the photojournalist who took those pictures, and he said, because it's a magazine that has an international, global distribution, he said, well, you've deceived the whole nation, and now you want to deceive the whole world. And so his hot temper really got him into trouble. And later, with the Socialist education campaign and the 4 cleanups, work teams sort of accused him of crimes that he didn't commit. And later, he had to retreat from the movie team and become a sort of a rural technician. So actually, when we went to visit him, he thought that we came to rehabilitate him from the government, and which is something that we weren't able to do at all. And it does sort of, when I go to the countryside, I feel that somehow the academic purpose and how our subjects understand our research is often at odds with each other. So perhaps our presence and questions had reminded them of the kind of the work teams, Maoist work teams, who came to visit and collected, embellished, and sometimes fabricated their stories. So perhaps it is the fear of this hijacking of the stories that the original team leader of the Three Sisters refused to speak to us. But as we also learned during the Cultural Revolution, they turned against their mentor, Wang Baoyi, as a capitalist roader because of his leadership position and bad class background. He was given an yin-yang haircut and paraded through the streets with a rope around his neck and a 2-meter-long dunce cap painted with oxen and snakes as 牛鬼蛇神. And Wang's memoir also recounted being imprisoned, forced to clean the public toilet, and he was escorted daily to read a special column of big character posters, 大字报, and caricatures against him. And actually later they said because everyone in the cultural bureau, in the cultural center, 文化馆 and 电影队, they're very talented. So their 大字报 and their struggle sessions were particularly spectacular and actually enjoyable for the public to come and watch. So, and then the three sisters themselves soon fell from grace because they had once performed for President Liu Shaoqi and First Lady Wang Guangmei, who was also herself had to suffer sort of humiliation wearing a necklace of ping pong balls. And then, because once Wang Guangmei invited the three sisters to show their slides in Beijing, and then invited them for dessert, for dinner actually, and then there was fresh peaches for dessert, and then the team leader did not eat her peach, but she enshrined it. She put like words on it, 力量的泉源, the source of power, and then so wall posters depicted this incident in caricatures of her worshiping the disgraced First Lady's peach until it had rotted. So at this, by late 1960s, film screenings almost halted, but there was only slideshows for the sake of condemning or exorcising class enemies as orcs, ox demon, and snake spirits. So I found some materials about like slideshows of certain films before they were being projected, films that were criticized as poisonous weed films, 毒草电影. But one of the projectionists in Laishui we interviewed, he had inadvertently superimposed a slide of a local capitalist roader onto an image of Mao. So it was an accident, but it also made him into an active counter-revolutionary, 现行反革命. And so it was no wonder that projectionists became paranoid about actually making slides, because they said that you can't pierce your hands by wiping machines, but it's very risky to wield a brush or write or paint. And so a lot of the more earlier sort of acts of innovation and creativity had ceased. Yet when the politics was a little died down a bit more, it was possible again to make a slideshow. And in fact, it became a requirement for the selection of projectionists into movie teams. And so my father and several of his friends were actually recruited into movie teams in order to paint these slides of local heroes and local events. As shown, this is a woodcut from 1972, and you can see that there's a kind of a requirement, or this is a suggestion that every movie team is supposed to show also interview locals, make slides, and then also explain the film that they projected, and then also hold discussions afterwards. Local cadres also mentioned that slideshows were very effective at labor mobilization and all kinds of local mobilization. So as late as 1980s, actually, this manual was also showing all kinds of animation tricks, but more pertinent to the army, including this panoramic battlefield, a sentinel on a night shift. So you can actually do a, like a pan as well as a tilt in a very cinematic way. You've seen the sunrise already, but you also have like, panoramic slides of this soldier kind of having a flashback of the battle pulled over his head. So these animated slideshows continued into the 1980s. Before television really came on. And by the time I went to Laishui in 2017, the county cinema still hosted this exhibition about the three sisters. And I talked to the cinema manager, Ms. Yu, who came into this projection network in the late 1970s as the little 小三姐妹放映队, or the Little Three Sisters movie team. And she talked about her training, and I really gained a new sense of respect for how much training went into being a slideshow or projectionist, because there's bike and horse riding, there's lasso, like you have to throw a rope in order to hang the screen. In the countryside, they also did voice training for narration and singing, manual training with bamboo clappers for the slideshows, and also a lot of coordination between the three projectionists. It's almost like a chamber music trio in some ways, right? So I realized that even though they were receiving the support of like, I guess, male authorship and craftsmanship, model female projectionists, they were not quite puppets controlled by male cadres or charlatans deceiving the public, but truly virtuoso performers at some level. So I want to come to conclusion, just some concluding thoughts and on this, what might this media archaeology of animated slideshows tell us about a creative ecology of socialist China? I think that my sense is that what goes against received wisdom, first of all, is that propaganda seemed to promote creativity. And I think I'm also very indebted to Lai Kwan's book for also this sort of thinking about creative production in the Cultural Revolution. And in socialist China, I'm really struck by the way people use the term 宣传, propaganda, not so much as, almost not so much as a noun as a verb. It's an act, right? Referring not to a collection of texts, but rather a constellation of actions. And it's actually an umbrella term for all kinds of creative endeavors that goes beyond operating machines, especially for the projectionists. The actual showing of the film turning on the machine is not 宣传. It's everything else, like going to interview people and drawing slides and performing slides and clapper talk. That's 宣传, right? So it's actually equated with creativity. And then the socialist institutions of rural cultural centers, 文化馆, and then,放映队, these projection teams. Also local, well, I'm currently actually researching broadcasting. I'm giving a talk about radio in 2 days. But like a 广播站 at the grassroots, broadcast station and drama troops really encourage local media production that integrated local talent. So something I realized that in the 1970s, 1980s, there would be these correspondents or 通讯员 at the grassroots. If they write an article, if they write a good feature story, it's very likely that the local broadcasting station will read it over these wired loudspeakers. So they become famous in the entire county. And so at that time, you can, like, it's very hard nowadays to imagine a piece of writing grabbing the attention of an entire county, right? So the talent, craft, and voices of these local artists actually made propaganda interesting and relevant for local audiences. So the question was not just how to animate slideshows, but also make slideshows animate their audiences. And if 动画 animation is defined and analyzed an art of movement, then socialist slideshows was all about mobilizing the masses to participate in movement. So from 动画 to 运动. And then, so another point is that the popularization of animated slideshow, or like when did it end? It ended because other technologies really came into being. And, but because of technological limitations, creativity actually is enhanced. I know I keep on thinking maybe more like about how generative AI is making it increasingly pointless to paint, to write, to do anything, because it feels like, okay, because the computer can do it so much better. But when it wasn't available, when the lack of cameras, the lack of television, even electricity, actually heightened the need for grassroots innovation and the significance of the human touch, gesture, voice, and choice. So it's very much the antithesis of AI-generated animation. These slideshows relied on manual labor, handicraft, voice performers, and tinkering. Their creation is collaborative, but also competitive. There's a lot of competition, and authorship was often anonymous. You can't really find out who had written the scripts or who had written these manuals even. So in that sense, the creative ecology there seems to share a bit generative AI's disregard for individual authorship and intellectual property. And the Three Sisters movie team, again, I feel like there's something to them that's similar to a tech startup, but their inventions had no marketable products. And their key rewards are also not profit, but a kind of a fame, I guess. But the uneven crediting still led to tension and resentment that erupted into conflict during the Cultural Revolution. So overall, animated slideshows still flourished with the propaganda mandate of that period and technological poverty, and becoming a site of indigenous innovation, artistic creativity. I guess like one final thing, I was thinking about this morning, so this is not my official conclusion, but I was thinking that creativity is not necessarily an absolute good either, because it seemed like it's a very creative team and they can really use their creativity to dehumanize these so-called class enemies and legitimize or even carnivalize the violence towards them. And so, creativity can help to mobilize labor, obeisance, hatred, fear, pride, and shame. So, and particularly with animation, coming back to this, it's able to exaggerate, caricature, and transform, and really drive home ideological points that are not easily achieved through words, photography, and cinema. So I would love to, also hear your thoughts about how, because I did put in the, how to think about creative ecology in the age of AI very late, because it's something that's very much on my mind, but I would love to hear your feedback. But for now, I will stop here, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Lee, for your inspiring talk. So now is a Q&A. I'd like to take advantage of my role as a moderator for Professor Lee's talk and ask the first 1 or 2 questions. So the first question is about the kind of emerging like a field of non-theatrical cinema studies. So your talk and also your book, Cinematic Gorillas, draw attention to a kind of non-theatrical cinemas, because in film studies, scholars often tend to pay attention to feature films released in theaters. But in recent years, there emerged a trend to study the non-theatrical cinemas. And this trend first happened in studies of American films, and then call it non-theatrical cinema, amateur cinema, useful cinema, and also educational cinema. So my first question is, how do you locate your research, and not just this talk, but also your new book, Cinematic Gorillas, in a larger field of non-theatrical cinema studies? And my second question is about the issue of technology. And I know that for the mobile projection and for the projectionists, they rely heavily on 16mm technology, the cameras and also the projectors. 16mm cameras and projectors were invented in the 1920s, and in the 1930s and the 1940s, this technology conquered the world, just like AI conquering the world today. And many mobile projection teams adopted this kind of portable camera and projectors. And I myself encountered a lot of accounts about 16mm technology. So I was wondering, in your research of Socialist China, the mobile projection teams, have you ever encountered any accounts or discussions about this technology that conquered the world in the 1930s and the 1940s? So these are my 2 questions. Thank you so much.
Hey, well, thank you so much for, I feel like I've finished my homework to you, thanks to the homework that you had given me. And indeed, I think I've always taken an interest also in documentary films, which are often non-theatrical, right? And particularly, I just recently came back from Dazhai, actually, because in the 1960s, there was a movement. Mao called on all of rural China to learn from Dazhai. Dazhai, this one village in Shanxi province, and they have been the subject of countless documentary and newsreels, and I went to many places in other provinces that had learned from Dazhai, including like one mountainous village in Wenzhou, where they talked about how in order to learn from Dazhai, they had actually, they were trying to build terraced fields. So Dazhai was famous for turning mountains into cultivatable fields. And then, but in that village, villagers said they had not seen films, but film had affected the village and changed the outlook, the landscape of the village, because the party secretary had gone to watch films about Dazhai and then started to transform it. So I became really interested in what is it that films do to their audiences, not just at a psychological level, but maybe even like to what it does to the physical landscape. And particularly in this period in the 60s and 70s, cinema was actually not necessarily for entertainment purposes. It of course served as entertainment as well, but these Dazhai films were all about just digging. And it was about physical labor, and so they were boring. People watched them, and they didn't necessarily find them inspiring. But these films really transformed the physical landscape and also people's daily schedule, because they had to work much early. Actually, one of the neighboring villages said, "Well, 大寨他们自己很卷，要我们跟着他们一起卷." So they were so competitive, and they wanted all of us to be so competitive too. And then other reactions was like, "Oh, 农业学大寨, learning from 大寨, we were so tired, like we were exhausted basically." And then so this regime of labor that was created had relied on like various media to propagate this, and cinema played a very big role, right? So I'm really curious about like how cinema affected. So in that sense, I think I'm also with the uses of cinema and other scholars' work, also some military uses. How does it promote maybe like usage of cinema for military purpose, even for violence? So yeah, and so I'm quite inspired by all of that as well. But with the 16 millimeter, there wasn't actually, so the prints, a lot of them are on 16 millimeter, but from 1970 onwards, there was actually very active promotion of 8.75 millimeter projectors, which were so lightweight that you can carry it on a shoulder pole and go up the mountains. So the number of projection units had actually quadrupled in the late 70s. Whereas so few films were made. So you can say that the whole Cultural Revolution decade is like a desert in terms of filmmaking. But in terms of film exhibition, it really expanded because of the portability of the technology, right? Yeah, so definitely like the film prints and also the projectors, when they're small enough, they can be carried up. And slides are even lighter. So they were actually even more widespread, but we don't have a lot of material to testify to how people reacted to them. Yeah, so I don't have too much information on the reception.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. I really learned a lot. So now the floor is open to the audience. If you have any question, please raise your hand. Our student helper will give the microphone to you. Yeah, Xuelan.
Thank you so much for the talk. I was taking a lot of notes, and there was several things that I was very curious about, and I have one question, and then I will explain my intention behind the question. So the question is very simple. So what kind of content gets repeated in this period through the slideshows? As I see some of the examples you've given us here, it has two levels overlaying, one background and one layer of words. So it seems like there is certain level of repetition possible here, right?
Yeah.
So that's my question. The reason for asking it is because I was thinking and I was taking notes, because this points to an important debate in generative AI. There is a tendency to differentiate creativity from generation. That's why generative AI is not called creative AI. And one of the things that distinguishes creativity and generative AI is exactly, creativity is not exactly repeating what is regurgitated from a large corpus. So that's why I was asking this question. I felt that distinguishing these could help me understand more what is the creativity side of these projectionist work.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and you're like exactly. I wanted to actually hear your feedback on the AI part. I think first of all, with the slides that I had been passing around, these are not the animated kinds, but I was trying to just find slides that are not mass manufactured. And the glass slides where you might, I think one of them actually, there's handwriting on it. And quite a few of them are what film is going to be screened today, right? Or something so that you can write on it and erase it and reuse it. So yeah, it's, but to enhance the aesthetic part, I don't know if there's much creativity in just, like writing down the information. I think what I found creative in what these slideshow projectionists or lanternists, I don't, like, they didn't necessarily give themselves a particular label, are invention and also artistry, and also the fact that like various local grassroots talents can be chosen to engage in sort of propaganda work. But some of it is actually very technical, right? So some of it's actually, this is another thing I just brought back from the Dazhai County, is that the local, I spoke to someone in charge of the wired broadcasting, and then he had tinkered for many years with automation. He was trying to automate the sound of East is Red, Dongfang Hong, in the morning, so you don't actually have to play the record. And so he developed this whole charts of trying to figure out, like, with the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, which exactly which kind of oh God, like vacuum tube, like radio equipment can produce that tone. And then he sort of built this this whole like automated, almost like a 电子琴 or like electronic music playing with the radio equipment that he had. And I was just very moved to see how much creativity, I think, or how much technical innovation has gone into it. I think I have to make up my own physics lessons to understand this. I have to admit I don't understand all the electric circuits. But it was really, and it's someone who is just working at the county 广播站, right? And then I also met people who are artists, who were singers, who were dancers, they were choreographers, and they were all serving 农业学大寨. They were all trying to promote this agricultural learning from our model village. And then, like writers, as I mentioned before, they as long as they adhered to the propaganda mandate, they can also write scripts. These are almost like film scripts. They didn't have the equipment to make films. So I think those are still like kind of human labor that goes into and also human imagination that went into the production of these like kind of locally relevant kind of a sort of broadcast media, and they also explain exactly, from the close-up to what is the animation effect here that is going to be used so that her eyes open and there's going to be a dissolve. There's a lot of thought that goes into this that I don't think is as robotic as some of the AI-generated products that I have seen, that there's something very predictable. But at the same time, I mean, of course, because they have to adhere to conventions, I am curious about the relationship between like formulaic, like algorithms and conventions. In what ways are they? Like, can people actually become very robotic in their thinking and in their formal inventions as well? Because there's formulas for how you write a propaganda text, how you make these slides, and how you paint as well. So perhaps there's a formula, and maybe that's also why it's somewhere between. I mean, even the artists themselves don't think they're artists. They talk about it's just 宣传 and it's just a tool. So, yeah, but I'd love to keep thinking about it with you, yeah.
Okay, Kenny and then Yiyang, right?
Thank you, Li Jie. I would like to see if you can talk more about sound and oral narration in the projection activities, particularly when you talk about mobilizing people or animate the people's emotions. And yeah, I think you might have some of these documents or records or about the audience, the performance of the performer. And particularly we talk about the projectionist apparatus. How about the broadcast apparatus? Is there something you can also talk more about?
Thank you. Yeah, I feel that this is actually like really. I was also talking to Shenqing about this. Because it's hard to find the slides, but it's actually still possible to find scripts. So scripts are available, the words are still available, but because I was paying so much more attention in the writing of this book to the infrastructure and to the sort of I guess I was thinking more about what instruments they were using, and I didn't think too much about the text until recently, now working on radio and thinking about radio scripts and the actual language, the actual content. But I was struck by just the wide range of instruments and also the voice training, because they were, like the three sisters were learning how to perform through like local storytellers and also through radio announcers. So all of this had to be trained, right? They kind of almost took lessons. But the composition of these clapper talk, they have to rhyme. I don't know. I think they kind of they're a little bit similar to spoken word or to like even like rapping. I like for actually students who had been working on like rap in China, I always say you have to go back to 快板书. You can't like start with the introduction of American hip hop. What about 快板书? And so I very much want to explore more also the sonic dimensions and the composition of kind of a very local grassroots poetry. Some of it's just for a very practical purpose, just saying the audience needs to sit down and these are the safety regulations. But a lot of it's also about seeing the praises of local workers. Like that's the general content. And some of it's a lot more poetic than others, right? But, and there's also competitions for that. And so like when they do a really good job, they get a larger audience, such as Zhou Enlai even. Yeah, so, but thank you. Thank you.
Iya.
Thank you so much, Ecologies, for this inspiring talk. I have a very small question, actually. I was wondering, so speaking of all these hand-drawn slides, obviously they speak to originality and authorship. So I was wondering, did these local village cultural centers and projection teams, did they ever claim ownership or authorship to this products of theirs? In other words, could other, you say a projection team from a different town come and borrow these slides without inviting their manpower to perform this, presentations? So that's basically my question. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. So the content that they produce were often at the local level, at the county level, right? So when one set of slides were made, they would be shown by all the projection teams throughout the county. So, and then sometimes also, if they win an award, then they would demonstrate it to other projection team who would also make their own slides. Yeah, but I think the authorship question is something that only got contested, I think, a bit later on. But through my interviews, I realized that there was contestation, not so much about authorship, but about like how credit is distributed, because it's a big team of people working. But from looking at the press materials, you would think it's 3 women who were like these super women who who worked all day and all night and were able to produce these amazing slides, and you didn't know, and also kind of in some ways the propaganda press was not showing, sort of excluding various people from. So then there's it's like they're not getting the credits at the end, but not so much authorship. There wasn't a sense of wanting to preserve. They're also very difficult to preserve. Like even, I think as I'm passing the slides around, like if you just rubbed it with your finger, you can rub off some of the colors. So yeah, they're very ephemeral, and they're not actually, I don't know if there's much, I think maybe what we could do is try to produce them ourselves, try to, or build a radio ourselves. So it's more, yeah, I don't know where it resides as a work of art. There wasn't a strong sense of authorship at that time.
Like Kwan and then Tanja and then the gentleman behind.
Thank you very much for this. I'm very exciting. Two things, both related to performance. You talked about your questions about the standardizations of the whole process. I think this is extremely important to the specificity of this kind of cultural products or productions or cultural practices, because it's very performative based.
Yeah.
It's like every single time differs, because you are going to different places, and every time you need to set up your own, as you mentioned, infrastructure, and then you have, it's almost like a makeshift kind of performance every time, and then they are doing it in a way that can never be standardized, almost.
Yeah.
But then they are also doing everything they could to standardize it, as you mentioned. So there is this, I mean, it's the rural projection that is the nature of it, that these people are going to the mountains to present almost like environment specific.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like every single performance is specific to the locality.
Yeah.
And so standardization can never be achieved as such, but this is this is propaganda, so it must be standardized. So I think there's a lot of tensions and conflicts over this specific kind of like form of propaganda that you mentioned that actually answer back to the questions that about AI, because I think this is so, in a way, you can say there are reference, but also there's so damn different too, because like this is performative much more than the AI is meant to be. I think it's not meant to be performative, right? I mean, there is a performative dimension of AI, I think, but then this is also extremely standardized to the extent that it's, a lot of efforts behind to make the generations sort of like presentable and predictable. That's my quick response to your questions. And then I want to ask you about also the performative dimensions about the Wang Guangmei scene.
Yeah.
This is amazing. I don't know that there's this projectionist behind. I wonder whether you want to say a bit more, because we do know that the Wang Guangmei event was very much a performance too. It's also very visual, spectacle. And so you're saying that there are projectionists involved in this. So I just wonder whether you want to say more about the spectacular dimension between Wang Guangmei and also the projectionist.
Okay, so I should clarify that it's not, it's after the fall of Wang Guangmei that anyone associated with her and with Liu Shaoqi became a target as well. And they were targeted in the same kind of carnivalesque way of, I mean, they didn't get ping pong ball necklaces, but they, I don't know what they did with peaches or like, I don't know. It's like they talked about, one of the saying from villagers I talked to at the time was like, oh, these, the three sisters rotted because they were the flowers before, and now they 臭掉了, and they became, so it was also like these very visceral metaphors about how because they had fallen from grace in some ways, and then, but that also was performative. So I think that one difference between, I don't know if you can talk about AI as performance. I think for me what's very key about performance is the presence of the body. And also like with the whole slideshow, that the role of the manual movements, the vocalization, live performance, this very immediate, in the room, you mentioned the environment of the screenings. And the content is actually not quite as standardized as we would. So I think that there's a big difference between what the slideshows were showing and what the 样板戏 were showing. So 样板戏 had to be standardized. There was very strict, although there were even local variations of local operas, right? And you wrote about this too. So, but with the content of the slideshows had to do with the local priorities at the time. And that's why they actually had to talk to the local cadres about what's important now. So if it's about pest, then how do we fight the pest? If it's about the local hero who had died, then we make something about the local heroes. So that actually is less standardized than so it's kind of a more improvised version of propaganda than film. Which is the same every time, right? And then part of what the films are doing is to standardize these performances, to people learn to perform 样板戏 the same way every time. But I think this is actually a lot more, there's a lot more freedom maybe to create something that's slightly different, and maybe and other than the Cultural Revolution, which was very volatile, there might be more room for just inventions that are more interesting.
So actually, it's made specifically for the event, or for the calendar.
So I got these in from like Konfuzi website, which is this. Yeah, I guess it's garbology research. And I don't know where they come from. I don't know how they were used. So it's also interesting, like how do we use these like material artifacts to make some conclusion? My sense is that they're not handmade, except for the. I think by the late 70s, a lot of there were slideshow or sort of slide factories in many places, and they were mass distributed. So the Leifeng set is absolutely a printed version, right? So the hand-drawn ones actually don't survive very long. There's also paper slides, like paper dipped into oil to make them transparent, but that has no chance of survival. Right? It's almost like sand painting or something. Thank you.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. So I wonder if you can say a little bit more about the concept of huan in Huandeng here.
Okay.
Yeah. So for example, I'm thinking about it's illusion enabled by lighting, but at the same time, it's also perhaps about a kind of enchantment, because it's about bringing things in to life. And also, I'm thinking about enchanted revolution, like Kang Xiaofei's recent work. So I wonder how you think about this notion of huan. Thank you.
I love this question, although I really haven't come across any discussion of the huan in Huandeng. In a very different context, when I was writing about Manchuria, actually, like films that were made in Manchuria, because Japanese scholars keep on talking about them as like huan, but maboloshi in Japanese as this kind of almost this phantasmagoric. So I was trying to translate huan as phantasmagoric because there's a haunted quality. But I think I'm not sure if I can read as much into the huan and huandeng, because it became such a standard term to I think there was actually someone else who has written quite extensively about Huandeng is Zhou Chenshu's book, and Cinema Off Screen. There's a whole chapter about, and I think she didn't actually use magic lantern. She thinks we can't actually call this magic lantern because of the projection, the quality of the slide projectors is closer to later projectors. But I think it actually varied a lot in the early Wenhua Guan type of these, self-made with gas lamps. That's actually very close to the older magic lanterns. So magic lantern, I feel, is it's a more fun translation of Huandeng, even though it has a very specific reference to the type of technology. Because by the 1950s in the US and in like Western country, like slide projectors refer to a bit more automation of like having a deck of slides that can go through the machine more quickly than like just putting them in one by one. And there's also overhead projector, which is another, yeah, so those are, yeah, but I do think that magic lantern or lantern having all these connotations of maybe also like deng, right, like deng and huan, perhaps we can trace it back in a more poetic way to think about the genealogy of this that goes beyond just this period. But thank you for that question.
Okay, the gentleman in the back.
Yeah, thank you again. This was really lovely and fun. Obviously, great visual aids and really interesting to think about. Professor Pong stole some of my ideas because I also wrote down tension being really, really key to this. The things I wrote down, you have both pre-planned and scripted material and then oral live material. You have both hand-drawn elements and mass-produced elements. You have localization and standardization. You have these national competitions where somebody wins a national competition. They come to train together at a national level, and then they go back and intensely localize the content that they're creating. You talk about the complexity of both creating the material, the circulation of the material, even erecting the infrastructure, the exhibition, and then a message that is often extraordinarily simplified down to a very, very direct, oversimplified story about these are three women, they do everything, they go everywhere, it's posed, it's fake, but it's also genuine. So all of these tensions are really fascinating. But I wanted to ask a question just a little bit about the actual performance itself, or however you want to kind of describe it. How long are we talking here? Like, how many slides were being used in an average performance? Did they have a structure to what would happen? Was there kind of a prologue where they'd welcome everybody with the first few slides and do local stuff first and then talk about national stuff? Was there a progression that they were following each time that they did this? And also, just in terms of time, as you mentioned, it takes time to show up, to talk to the local cadres, to figure out the message that they want to actually produce, then to animate that message, to write the scripts. How long were they spending in these places? How long was an average trip to this place? Would they do several nights? And then also, kind of relatedly, were there other attractions that would happen after the slideshow? Are we getting a slideshow and then somebody's doing a performance or doing the puppetry or things like that? Just kind of the actual experience of the day. Like, what does that look like?
Thank you. Yes, so I think the length really varied because there were slideshows that were just like 1 or 2 slides, right, to say, be quiet, or it's time to get, and then there's also slides earlier on to introduce a film, to explain the characters, because audiences might get confused about who is who. There's very local slides, but with the 3 sisters, I think they were impressive because they produced a kind of a larger number, maybe like, I actually haven't, I can't, I think more around like 50 slides is this, but if you look at like the Leifeng, that deck of slides, that's about 30, right? So that might be standard, but sometimes they have more elaborate productions. And some of the scripts that, unfortunately, I didn't photograph those, but in the exhibition hall, I saw that they had also instructions about what music to play. So they actually had to change it on this, LP player, actually. So it's a lot of physical, mechanical tasks that are being performed at the same time. And so there's something really, you can watch the performance of these machines almost like an orchestra, or not quite an orchestra. That's why I thought like a chamber music or something, right? And these were always taking place before the film screenings. But I've read various versions of how much people were, like what program before the film existed. And in the book, I actually compared much more to like almost, there's something liturgical about the process, that it's almost like going to church and you have, everybody settling down. They might play a music at the beginning, like entry music. And then when they settle down, there'd be like readings and, or like announcements, and I guess it could also just be you can think about it as agenda, but because a lot of almost very, not religious, but almost like, talking about transmitting the revolutionary spirit and so on. So there is something almost like film screening is about, it's less, one of my key phrases in the book is about film is less representational than it's congregational. It's about bringing people together and participating in these rituals. And it was actually quite important to have, and also because there's a lot of time where people are just waiting for film prints to arrive. Because there are very few film prints in general. So the same print might need to be screened in 5 villages in one night. And so they did something called copy running or 跑片. So there would be 4 simultaneous screenings, and they would start with one reel here. And when they're done, it's 10 minutes, right? Somebody would get on a bike and bring that reel to the next location and then wait for the next reel. So there's actually a lot of time between rewinding the wheels or waiting for the next reel. There's all this dead time. So what they do is to get people to sing together. And so imagine also singing competitions. This started in the army, but they started doing this all over the place, called 拉歌, and to see which side will sing. Usually not sing better, but sing louder, right? So imagine I divided the room into 2 parts, and you all had to sing one song after another, just to pass the time so that you can finish watching the film. And so, there's a lot of programming that might also be somewhat improvised, depending on the whole situation. Yeah, so indeed, it's quite unique every time because of the physical conditions of these film screenings in the countryside.
Yeah, I think now we have some time to collect the last round of questions. So if you have any questions, raise your hand, and we will connect all the questions together. This gentleman.
Selecting these 3 sisters, the young 3 sisters, there's a gender element in putting the highlight on these protagonists, while there was a much larger team. Was this a pattern in propaganda in this period?
I think there's an effort to brand this movie team. So they were very consciously creating a model that also a kind of a brand that will make them more famous than others. And the 3 sisters somehow became a very useful brand for the entire team, so that by the time photojournalists came, they really wanted only the 3 of them because they embodied. Also, I think the idea of female projectionists, I guess female tractor drivers to some extent too are very public figures too. But female projectionists, they're out there, and then so they're actually performing work that is usually men's domain, but they're also extremely visible, so that they are really carrying or embodying the idea that women can can do whatever men can do, and also can be seen in the public domain. I think they also stayed. So when they went into these villages, sometimes they stayed with elderly women who would normally not come out and watch films. But because they're staying with them, they're more likely to persuade that demographic into the political process. So I think that having women actually as projectionists also help to recruit audiences who would otherwise may not be coming to cinema. Yes, but gender absolutely was a key dimension, and yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Lee, for your wonderful talk and for the exciting Q&A. Let's give her a big applause.
Thank you everyone.